This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Hi everyone and welcome back to Coronial. I'm Emma.
I'm Georgie.
And I'm Alice.
And today we're going to be talking about a recent inquest that was held in South Australia relating to the death of a young girl, Adelene Leong, who was 8 years old at the time of her death, which occurred in September 2014, when she was ejected from her seat on the Air Max 360 amusement ride at the Royal Adelaide Show.
Can I make a point of the inquest was held over so many dates. It wasn't actually recently held, but it was only recently released.
Well, what were the dates again?
It was December 2020, February, May, June, August, September 2021. And then it was finally released on the 7th of June 2022.
Right. I wonder if COVID had a lot to do with that as well.
Just a lot of information as well.
Yes.
Yeah, there was just so much information, right?
Yeah.
And so many people they needed to interview.
Yeah. And it would have been dictated by the other trials that were going on as well.
Yes, that is true.
The coroner tends to release after those have been managed enough appropriately that they can then not interfere with that.
Yeah,
Makes
so
sense.
this one is quite a large inquest. It had a lot of public interest as well at the time. So that's why we're doing this episode a little bit differently. It's going to be a compilation episode. So Georgie, Alice and I will be each talking a little bit about the same case, which has been fun. And hopefully it'll be interesting for you guys to listen along to as well. I guess my particular interest in this case is that I am from Adelaide, and this particular death occurred in Adelaide at the Royal Adelaide Show, which was an event that I attended many, many times throughout my childhood and into my adulthood. Has a lot of nostalgic memories for me. And I was actually at the show the day when this incident happened. I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't see it, but I do remember that there were a lot of alarms going off throughout the day and no one really knew what was happening. And it wasn't until I got home later that evening and turned on the TV and saw that a young girl had tragically passed away on one of the rides. One of the rides that looked familiar, but apparently it was the first time it was ever at the Adelaide Show.
Yeah, this was its opening year at the Adelaide Show.
Yeah, but it just looked like one of those rides that are at every show, right? It just looked typical. And we'll explain all of that a little bit more.
Ride that everyone, well, Emma and I have probably been on in our childhood. Looking at Alice, I'm fairly certain this is not a thing for her. She's more of a teacups lady.
Right.
Ferris wheel, teacups.
Ferris wheels are not
Carousel.
as safe as you might think.
Yeah, but at least they don't go fast.
They do sometimes gain some speed though.
Okay, I've only ever been on slow Ferris wheels then.
You go on the grandma Ferris wheel.
You like the
Yes,
Ferris wheels
yeah.
that are all encapsulated.
Yes. Yeah, like little pods. No, I am not a ride person. I do not enjoy that level of going fast with no control over it.
How many
So,
times did we go
never.
on the Superman ride in Singapore?
Oh, no, that wasn't the Superman. Wasn't that the
Yeah, because it had the blue and red side.
I have no idea.
Whatever ride we were on, it had
Yeah,
a
there
blue
was
and a
this-
red side. One
it was
went
like
forwards,
it was
one went backwards.
Battlestar Galactica.
Was
Because
it?
it was like the battling sides. And like even like at the Adelaide Show, I reckon the number one ride that I used to go on over and over and over again was the Hard Rock. Do you remember
The
that one?
Hard
It was
Rock?
like that claw one that goes and swings.
No, I remember
That sounds
Mad
horrendous.
Mouse?
The Mad Mouse is brilliant.
literally was like a two-person car, and you just put a seatbelt over your lap
Yeah,
and went around on this roller coaster, and like
And when you say around on a roller coaster, is it like it just went through
it was
like a haunted house type thing, or was it like going up and down?
No,
and
no,
side
no.
to
It was
side?
like
down
a
and round
wooden
corners, yeah.
It was like a wooden outdoor like really old. It was from like the 50s.
yeah.
Like a really old roller coaster, and it was one of those ones that kind of just loop around, and then the hairpin turns back and forward.
And when you hit that hard corner,
You go,
you
Yeah,
play
get slung around.
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, how do we describe this ride? It was like arms coming off, right? And then
Yes.
each arm had,
2 seats.
and then the whole main machine of the arms rotated, and then you've
Yep.
got the seats rotating
Mhm.
as it then moving up and down vertically,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's got lots of axes
Yes.
Yes.
of movement.
Yeah. And so I had quite a lot of movement. And then the spinning speed also, for me, was so much more than I was expecting
Mhm.
for an 8-year-old to go on. Like when
Yep.
you were 8,
I was going on the teacups in the Matterhorn.
yeah. And so that also for me was really interesting, that not that Adeline's mum let her on it. Like Adeline was clearly having a great time and really enjoying the rides around the show, because there's some evidence that Adeline's mum didn't go on this ride because of how nauseous she was feeling
Yeah.
at the time. So she'd also clearly been dragged on some rides by her daughter, which I think is just adorable that they were having such a good time together.
Mm.
And a tragic event to have happened after they were having such a good time together. But yeah, this seemed like a very serious ride for such a young kid to be permitted on. And I don't ever remember being able to go on those rides at that age. But maybe that's my experience, where my parents were a bit more cautious about what I
No.
went on.
Yeah, that might be it. Not until I was a teenager
Yeah.
that I really started venturing onto rides that had any sort of over the shoulder, I guess,
Strapping.
harnesses that you really needed to be
Yeah.
buckled in. But again, I remember they used to be really strict on the height
Yes.
and having to get
Mhm.
measured and things like that on all of
Yeah.
those rides. So, and again, to be honest, I haven't been to a show in a very long time, nor have I been a child in a very long time. So I don't really know if any of that's changed.
Emma, what are you talking about? We're all 21. The fact that this still happened,
Yeah,
clearly
in
a lot of
2014.
changes are still required in terms of safety around these. I think back to the lap seatbelts of when I was younger, and I'm like, okay, cool, probably won't get away with that now. But then you read some stuff like this, and there's still a bit to be done.
That's right. All right. So Adeline was born on the 14th of October 2005 in Malaysia. On the 9th of September 2014, she arrived in Adelaide with her mother to visit her late father's sister. Adeline was very close with her mother, especially since the passing of her father in 2009. She was an only child, and she and her mother were due to return back to Malaysia on the 20th of September that year. So Adeline and her mother arrived at the Royal Adelaide Show around 10 a.m. on the 12th of September 2014. They went on a number of rides together and were having a great time. They went and had some food, and at about midday, Adeline lined up to ride the Air Max ride. The Air Max was a carousel type ride which featured 12 arms, with each arm supporting 2 seats. So there were 24 seats in total. Each arm is connected to a central post, which is called a turret, and is able to move up and down on a vertical plane relative to the central turret. So basically each arm kind of can move up and down vertically.
And that was in like a hinging motion. It wasn't like a vertical up and down
Yeah.
movement. It was a hinge from that central turret.
If you kind of think of it, it looks kind of like a spider.
Yeah, it
Is
really
the best
does.
way to describe it. And from that, the spider's legs
Yeah.
go kind of up and down in a vertical axis.
But also a spider with 12 legs.
Come on, Georgie. It's a mutant
I was
spider,
gonna say
okay?
it's a mutant spider.
Each carriage, so where the 2 seats are also able to rotate in a circular motion. So the legs are going up and down, but also each carriage is kind of spinning around in a circle. The carriages attached to each arm have independent movement and spin around simultaneously with the rotation of the arms. So on top of it, the ride is also spinning around.
The central turret is in fact spinning as well.
So you're spinning while you're spinning.
You're spinning while you're spinning,
and
while
not
you're
necessarily
moving up and down.
in the same direction, because the central turret could be going clockwise while you're sitting in the chair going anti-clockwise.
That's right. And the way that the individual carriages are spinning are independent from each other. So not all the carriages are spinning the same way and doing the same thing.
So it's a bit unpredictable.
Interesting.
You never know which way you're going to be spinning.
That's exactly right.
I think
So
the ride did have a specific set of
it
ways it
did,
went.
But that was in terms of the clockwise, anti-clockwise around
Yeah.
the central turret rather
Yeah.
than the individual carriages on the...
Yeah,
I think it had
okay,
different
sorry.
settings as well.
True.
Mhm.
But like as a patron on the ride, you wouldn't know.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So basically, to sum that all up, the forces on the rider's body at the time of the ride are both vertical and horizontal. And on the day that Adeline was riding the Air Max, the ride appeared to be operating with one of the arms not working. So it was kind of just down.
Right, so it was rotating along with the other
It was
arms.
rotating around the central, but it was not going up and down. And there was obviously no one in the carriage.
Yep.
Can you imagine if you paid for that ride?
So after a couple of minutes of lining up in the ride, the Air Max stopped. The patrons that were currently on the ride left their seats, and Adelene was at the front of the line for the next ride. So she moved onto the ride first and moved on to arm 8, seat 15 of the ride. She was the only person in the dual seat carriage, as her mother had decided not to go on this ride because she felt nauseous from the previous ride that she was on. And there were also 8 other adult patrons that were on the ride with her. The ride began at 12:11 p.m. and was completing one clockwise rotation every 6 seconds. So that's one rotation around that central turret. And that meant that it was traveling at a speed of 10 revolutions per minute. So on the 11th revolution of the ride, Adelene was ejected from her seat. She landed about 21 metres away from the ride and sustained fatal injuries, having been ejected at a minimum speed of 100 kilometres per hour. The estimations from the different mathematicians and physicists who looked at it said that she could have been ejected anywhere between 100 kilometres per hour and 230 kilometres per hour.
Wow.
So quite a speed.
Hmm.
So for context, the ride is operated from a control booth with an electronic touch screen, and physical controls can be operated at various speeds of rotation from 0 to 10, with 0 being the slowest speed and 10 being the fastest. So as I mentioned, at a speed of 10, a complete rotation was every 6 seconds. The recommended speed by the manufacturer was 8.5. But as I mentioned, evidence shows that the ride was operating at a speed of 10. So it was operating faster. So emergency services arrived around 12:20, but had to progress slowly through the heavy pedestrian traffic and narrow pathways to get to Adelene. Obviously, if you think about a show, lots of people around. Yeah. They've often got narrow pathways, so a bit difficult to navigate. So it did take an additional 6 minutes for the paramedics to get from the outskirts of the showgrounds into where Adelene was. However, it was evident that Adeline's life could not be saved with the extent of her injuries. So this delay had no overall impact on
And considering those speeds, you wouldn't expect there would be much they could do.
I can touch on this a little bit. Basically, it sounds like the show didn't have a particularly good centralized way of distributing information to all the various important stakeholders at the show, such as security. There was St. John's ambulance, and it already had occurred that they had identified an incident at the Adelaide show earlier in the week of the show, that there was some communication lapses there. Mm-hmm. And they had elected to manage that and improve that post the end of this show, given it's a 10-day event. They were like, okay, that has happened unrelated to Adelene a few days earlier, but we will deal with this once the show is over.
Right.
And so it was mentioned by the coroner that that was less than ideal given Adeline's subsequent incident, but I guess hindsight's 2020 there, that, you know, every other year they probably could have got away with the fact that they'd had one incident. They planned to rectify it, but didn't rectify it in an appropriate timeliness. Mm-hmm. And so unfortunately it meant that the ambulance officers had pulled up to a particular entrance, expecting someone to be able to meet them at that entrance and take them through, but no one had. And ultimately, therefore, the ambulance officers had to make their own way to Sideshow Alley because no one knew of the incident that had occurred because it hadn't been communicated to wherever they'd arrived. Mm-hmm. But it's the Adelaide show. If you've lived in Adelaide, you know where Sideshow Alley is in the Wayville Showgrounds. And so they ultimately made their way there themselves. Mm-hmm. They didn't specifically require too much additional direction, but it did just slow that down a little bit. But as we said, it didn't change the outcome.
No.
It wasn't going to make a difference, but certainly another one of those things that we're going to get to along the way around management of the show and big events like this. And again, comes back to when events occur, just like one of our very early episodes.
Polly's Law.
That when you have big events like this, it can really change that dynamic of expectations for management and what sort of resources you need available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So Adelene was transferred to the Women's and Children's Hospital, which is in North Adelaide, where she was pronounced dead at 1:42 p.m. Her cause of death was multiple injuries, including skull and facial fractures. This case was referred to the coroner as it was deemed in the public interest to reveal the extent of the issues into the cause or circumstances of Adeline's death, specifically the Air Max's operation, maintenance and governance, which obviously we will be exploring. A reminder that the coroner's function is not to make any finding or suggestion of civil or criminal liability regarding any person or corporation, but rather it focuses on the cause and circumstances of a person's death and to make a recommendation or recommendations that might prevent or reduce the likelihood of a recurrence of a similar death. So in this case, there were concurrent criminal trials that happened in relation to the circumstances of this death, but that's not the coroner's function. The coroner purely looks into the circumstances of the death and makes recommendations in relation to hopefully preventing or mitigating the risk of these kind of things happening in the future. So just keep that in mind as we're exploring some of the issues in this inquest.
And I mean, they were mentioned anyway, and ultimately I find their outcomes a little bit disappointing anyway.
Yeah.
And I should also have made that clear. The criminal trials happened prior to this inquest being released.
Yes.
This inquest was only just recently released in early June. But this is an extremely frustrating case. Extremely frustrating in terms of the number of things that went wrong and the fact that when we say things went wrong, we say there was deception.
This is certainly one that's different to previous ones we've talked about where it's a number of things lining up and just accidents happen.
Mm-hmm.
This one certainly was a number of things that appeared to be misaligned.
Purposefully.
Yeah. And we talk about like the Swiss cheese, but I think this is just like a giant black hole. It was inevitable, and it's not that multiple things had to happen in order for the death to occur. It was going to happen.
I was about to say it was a matter of time, to be honest, with this one.
So much of me wishes that, someone had identified it earlier. But there were so many things that I'm like, that could have been mentioned. That could have been picked up. Those things.
So many missed opportunities.
Should have happened. And it doesn't just affect the one individual. Like they talked about Adeline's mother and how devastating it had been for this widowed mother of an only child who doesn't reside in Australia. Devastating. But on top of that, there's the people that witnessed the event. There's the people that worked on the ride.
Oh, so good to remember. This obviously occurred at a show, a large city show, not a country show.
Yeah.
A lot of attendees and a lot of the attendees at Sideshow Alley. And I don't know if this is similar for all shows across Australia, but in the Adelaide show, Sideshow Alley is where all the rides are. So I wanted to just start with some background about the Air Max and its operators. So the Air Max was imported into Australia from Spain in 2013 by their Australian-based owners, who we are going to be calling Ms. S and Mr. W, who were experienced ride operators having worked in the industry together for over 20 years. They had purchased the Air Max from a Spanish company called Safeco for over $1 million, and both owners became directors of the company CJ and Sons Amusement Proprietary Limited, which we'll call CJS. And this company was formed to purchase and operate the Air Max specifically. So in August 2011, Ms. S began the process for seeking funding to purchase the Air Max. So they sought funding of just over $1.025 million with a 10-year repayment plan to purchase the ride. According to the business plan, the Air Max needed to be open to the public 13 hours a day during the multiple shows that it operated in order to be profitable. So it was approximated that the ride would need to operate at 4 shows per month for those 13 hours per day, with a patronage of 3,600 customers per day, which would equal about 58% capacity of the ride, at a cost to $8 to $10 per ride, which would generate a per-day income of about $26,000. So they were the projections.
That's a lot of shows.
It's a lot of rides.
Like every weekend you're going to a different place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
and
travel.
running it for 13 hours
and I
a
assume
day.
that it doesn't travel as is.
You'd have to pack it down.
And even just what happens if the truck that you use to transport it breaks down.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's so many factors.
There's no contingency there.
Yeah, that was one of the big issues. So on the 1st of May 2012, the business plan was accepted and CJS was granted the loan as requested. On the recommendation of the broker, they were advised to purchase the ride from Safeco. The ride was purchased in June 2012 and arrived unassembled in Australia on the 23rd of April 2013. As part of the report, the coroner analysed the financial status of CJS, as it had been suggested through evidence given in the inquest that CJS had put profit above safety and procedure. So throughout the early life of the loan, CJS requested multiple extensions to their repayments. By September 2013, the average daily earnings had been just $4,100, which was well below the $26,000.
Wow, that is a huge decrease.
Yes. So in December 2013, CJS was sent a breach notice for underpaying its repayments, and by August 2014, so a month before Adeline's death, CJS had insufficient funds to make repayments. So notably, in the month prior to the Royal Adelaide show, the Air Max had suffered a significant breakdown at the Royal Queensland show in Brisbane, which is commonly referred to as the Ekka. This placed CJS in desperate financial strife, which meant the revenue from the Adelaide show was absolutely vital. So it was submitted to the coroner that because of this financial pressure, safety became less of a concern as maximising ticket sales at the Adelaide show.
Yep.
So it had obviously suffered some previous breakdowns, and obviously the Ekka would have been a massive show for it to break down and not be earning revenue at. So they're like, next big show.
Yeah, considering they needed 13 hours a day of operation.
Well, more than probably.
Yeah, even that was their best case scenario, was 13 hours of operation a day. So
But I'm just trying
put
to
in
think, like, the
one
Adelaide
breakdown.
show only went till 9 or 10 p.m. So what are you saying?
I mean, there's no more hours to operate, is there?
Well,
Yeah,
I
that's what
think
I mean.
if it opens at 8.
But I can't remember Sideshow Alley major rides running that early either. Like, as
Yeah,
in
or just there not being enough people to go on them.
Yeah, especially at those prices. I mean, that's expensive.
maybe I'm wrong, but my memory is like the rides didn't really start till like 11 anyway.
Yeah.
And then everything shuts down by 10 in Adelaide because it's Adelaide.
It's Adelaide. Yeah.
All right. Tell us about
the registration requirements.
The DRs and the PRs.
The DRs and the PRs. So as an amusement device, by Australian law, the Air Max had to be subject to what's called a design registration, which I'll probably refer to as a DR.
I mean, but did it? But we'll get there.
We'll get there. As well as a plant registration or a PR. Design registration is the process undertaken by a safety regulator, and its purpose is to ensure that the designer has adhered to recognised published safety standards so that the design will be without risk to the health and safety of any person who operates or uses the plant or the ride. Plant registration is the process undertaken by a safety regulator recording details about a high-risk item of plant. The purpose of PR is to ensure the plant is inspected by a competent person and is safe to operate in accordance with the workplace health and safety regulations. So that's a bit about the two different registration requirements. So in Australia, there's a mutual recognition between Australian states and territories of design registration and plant registration. So in other words, DR and PR issued by one state are recognised by the other states as being valid in that state. Both registration processes require significant work and documentation to be presented by the owner, showing the plant has reached the required safety standard known as the Australian standards. So the relevant Australian standard for amusement rides is AS3533, and its objective is to provide regulators, designers and manufacturers with requirements for the design and construction of amusement rides to promote uniformity with regards to design principles, manufacture and registration of these devices. So essentially, this standard imposed duties on all relevant persons involved with amusement park rides, including owners, operators and maintenance personnel, to ensure that the ride is safe, is really the bottom line of all of that. In terms of the Air Max, CJS engaged a well-known engineer in the industry to be their agent and expert in obtaining the Air Max's DR. However, this engineer, who had passed away by the time of the inquest, had previously stated that he had never completed the DR of the Air Max, but did not know whether it had been done by someone else. Early contention.
And that information was gained through like some emails and some other documents that had been recovered, but they weren't able to access all of his documents, I think.
That's right. So this engineer had not completed the DR because there was a major and ongoing issue with the Air Max surrounding the air tanks that had been supplied by the manufacturer Safeco, as those tanks did not comply with the Australian standards. These air tanks had been inspected for certification, but no documentary evidence was provided to the coroner that the air tanks had ever been certified as compliant. The only evidence produced was from the owners, who stated that they were told the air tanks were compliant. However, there was conflicting evidence produced that the owners knew the air tanks were non-compliant, as they had told their loan provider that they would use funds to replace the air tanks.
Which they never did.
Putting two and two together, they knew that they needed to replace the air tanks because they were non-compliant, but they also gave evidence to the coroner that they didn't realise that the air tanks were non-compliant. So there was a bit of inconsistency there.
The counter-argument there is that they'd just been told they should replace them, but they didn't realise that they were the absolute necessity for the regulation.
Mm-hmm. So despite the registration process not being completed by the engineer and the air tanks seemingly never being certified for compliance, the Air Max was given a DR number, or DRN, of Q21673. The prefix of Q on this DR number indicates that it was supposedly granted by the Queensland government. However, no document was produced to the coroner to establish that the DR was ever granted by the Queensland government for the Air Max. In fact, the engineer who was engaged by CJS indicated that he intended to obtain the DR from the New South Wales government.
And the coroner never figured out where that DRN came from.
No.
There were 3 possibilities.
Which we go into.
Yeah.
So the DRN that I read out had been used for 2 amusement devices registered in 2002 and 2004, respectively. So it had already been used.
And they're supposed to be unique numbers.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're repeated.
Yes, but these were both techno jump rides, which were owned and operated by different owners, but they were built to the exact same design. So remember, this is a design registration.
Right.
So if they have the exact same design.
Okay, it's not a unique number to
the
a
ride.
ride.
Particular ride,
it's a
it's
unique
to a
number
design.
to design. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
This has changed everything about what I read.
Glad we've clarified that.
Thank you.
These techno jump rides had been registered by the engineer engaged by the Air Max owners. So there was a relationship there as well. However, the Air Max is a different design to the techno jump ride, so it required a different DRN. There was no dispute about that.
It was similar, wasn't it?
It was
the
similar
techno
type of ride.
Yeah, and the techno jump is what they were going to purchase,
Yeah, I
and
think
then they
so.
ended up with the Air Max.
Yeah.
That's right. So slightly different ride, needed a different design registration.
And it was a little bit convoluted around, they knew some of those people that had owned those techno jumps, yeah?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the coroner raised 3 different scenarios on how the Air Max came to have the DRN, which was the same as the techno jump machine, all of which involved different personnel who had commonalities between the 2 rides, either directly or indirectly disclosing the DRN in some way. So the Air Max owner's evidence was that the engineer had provided or obtained the false DRN and certified the Air Max under that DRN. However, it was the engineer's position that he never provided the false DRN to the owners. And as I said, this claim couldn't be tested. The parties in the other 2 scenarios also denied giving the owners of the Air Max the false DRN. The coroner was unable to come to a conclusion of how the false DRN was obtained by the Air Max. But in summary, the Air Max should not have been available to the public until the design registration was completed.
Absolutely.
So the design registration was never completed. As I said, the DRN was obtained somehow, and it was then used to obtain the plant registration, or the PR, for the Air Max. So the PR was done through Victoria, and the certificate was issued by WorkSafe Victoria on the basis of an online application without any requirement for visual inspection. So no supporting documentation was needed for the application. So they just got the DR number, which they thought was legitimate because apparently they don't check these things. So they just thought, yeah, all good.
And look, I can get that in the sense of it being a design registration.
Mm-hmm.
That in theory, because, how many times would they want to see that certificate for what's a really common, the slingshot, yeah?
Oh, yes, okay.
How many of those exist? Let's say more than one in Australia.
Yep.
How many times would the Victorian government really want to check that
Look at the
certificate
slingshot.
for that design registration. You'd think they're probably all the same design. If it's a slingshot ride, they're going to be like, cool, it's got the slingshot DRN.
Yeah.
Happy days.
It's all good. They just took for granted that it had been properly obtained. Which, I mean, why would you really question that it had? I don't know.
Agreed. But also, all it needed to do was the fact that it had a different name. Like the
Yeah,
DRN
all you
was
needed to do
registered
was
to
look
a
it up and-
techno jump.
Yeah.
And this was an Air Max. But again, do all the slingshot rides have the same exact name?
I don't
Even
know.
if they're the same design per se. Anyway, I'm not an expert in the amusement ride industry, so
I don't think any of us are.
yeah.
So once the Air Max was registered as a plant item in Victoria, it was mutually recognised in South Australia as having a valid plant registration. So the PR was granted on the 8th of May 2013, and after the PR was issued, it was never examined by authorities again until after Adeline's death. So essentially, the notice of registration being the DR and PR had the effect of everyone simply accepting that the registration of the Air Max was satisfactorily dealt with. So the Air Max was a new attraction at the Royal Adelaide Show, as I said, in September 2014, and had been operating around Australia at various other showgrounds prior to this incident, including at the Ekka in Brisbane and also at the Royal Easter Show in Sydney, to name a few. And as I mentioned before, the PR was obtained for the Air Max in Victoria. And although there was a mutually beneficial systems in place in terms of recognition of registration rides in other jurisdictions, as I said, the society, being the Royal Adelaide Agricultural Society, which runs the Adelaide Show, did not automatically accept amusement rides that had their PRs registered in Victoria or WA as valid. Even though this wasn't legally an issue, this was just sort of a policy, I guess, of the Royal Adelaide shows that they didn't accept PRs from Victoria or WA. It doesn't go into why.
Let's assume it had something to do with the way that you gained your PR. Like we talked about the Victoria being an online one. Maybe the
Potentially.
Other states had an in-person where you're actually presenting your certificates and stuff.
But we don't know that. So I guess the intricacies of this registration issue continue because on registering the Air Max ride with the Royal Adelaide Show, the owners of the Air Max provided an application which said the DRN was valid and registered in Queensland, which we know it wasn't, and that the PR was obtained in New South Wales.
But it was actually...
It was actually obtained in Victoria, but because the Royal Adelaide Show didn't accept Victorian PRs for whatever reason...
Right. And so the owners would have known that they didn't accept
I mean, it doesn't go that
Victorian-
far. The owners don't say that.
But that's the inference, right?
That's the inference from it.
I was going to say, I think the owners claimed accident. Like, so I think
we just put the wrong state down?
Female owner,
Oops.
Mrs. S, said that she didn't mean to put New South Wales down. She didn't realise the mistake she'd made. Yeah.
Right.
But whether we choose to believe that,
Yeah.
it's tricky.
It's
It's tricky
a
that
convenient mistake.
it's happened twice.
Yeah. It's the problem that there is a number of inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And as they start to add up, it makes me much more cynical.
That's right. So in order to operate a ride at the Royal Adelaide Show, the Society granted licenses for operators to run rides at the show, and this was overseen by the Society's senior project manager. So in this case, on the 3rd of January 2014, the owners of the Air Max submitted an expression of interest to operate at the 2014 Royal Adelaide Show. The registration details were never challenged or verified via the Society, noting that they didn't have any access to any information database to verify this information anyway. So they really had to take on face value. I mean, they probably could have called up and done more things, but...
But again, are you going to do that
you
for
going
every
to-
single ride
Exactly.
that's registered?
You're not going to think that these things have been falsified.
True. There should be an easier way to access that information.
I think so.
It should just be very easy.
Let's double check that this is correct.
Yeah, and have some sort of database.
Someone's not mistyped
national
something.
database that you can check
Yeah.
easily.
So on 15 May, the Society sent out a site license agreement, which included a safety documentation checklist that was required to be signed by an engineer and the owners. This covered all the different workplace health and safety requirements. So this was required to be signed and returned before any equipment was permitted to enter the showgrounds. This safety checklist was never returned to the Society, a fact that was not discovered until after Adeline's death. As this document had not been completed and submitted, the ride should not have been allowed to enter the showgrounds at the Royal Adelaide Show. So there's another failure. Not necessarily on the owner's part this time, but another reason why the ride should not have been operating at the show.
Because if the society demanded that you need to have this checklist filled in and sent back to them, they should have been following up
Exactly.
on whether or not they had them.
Mm-hmm.
You say not necessarily the owner's fault, but again, I think this was another one of those moments where they knew they weren't going to be able to adequately complete the paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a risk that they elected to not complete it and
Just see what happens.
Yeah. Like, my reading of it was very much that there was something on there that would have flagged, and so there's a suspicion that
potentially. And I don't know if
completed.
the other shows that this ride had been operating at had similar. I would assume they would all have similar sort of workplace health safety requirement checklists that they had to meet, and I don't know what happened.
Well, I mean, I go into another check that happens after they set
Right.
up as well, and even they got through that check as well. So, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it sounds like yes, there were checklists, but how much meaning
they
those
weren't being, they
checklists
were not
actually-
effective in checking vital things.
Yeah.
So in summary, there are a number of consequences of the DR and PR being accepted as legitimate. All subsequent inspections of the Airmax by engineers and regulators assumed that the assignment of the DRN and PRN meant that the necessary verifications for registration had occurred. Makes sense. And the air tanks that operated the Airmax had no DR for them as required and therefore were not compliant with the Australian standards. So basically the Airmax bypassed the system, which could be contributed to, at least in part, by a lack of communication between the relevant jurisdictions. So submissions from 2 interested industry bodies were received in relation to this coroner's inquest. They raised concerns that there was no national framework for standards across Australia to be uniformly and reliably recorded for all relevant regulators and inspectors to access. So both of those regulators suggested a national database of information to be accessible to all authorities nationwide so that different jurisdictions can check and see if DRs and PRs have been legitimately obtained in other jurisdictions.
I 100% agree.
Yep.
A bugbear I have of living in Australia is the disconnect between states.
Even with coroner's reports, like
Yeah.
a lot of these things could be, I'm sure, better communicated across state lines. But yeah, it's very specific in terms, and it has to be jurisdictional based in terms of the recommendations, yes. But I mean, a lot of these things are so relevant to other areas. Like this is relevant to all the other shows across the country, not just in South Australia. This one is a little bit different. It does go further, but most of them are very state specific. And in some instances, that's completely relevant. I mean, in the crocodile attack ones or things like that are very state specific, that's fair enough. But in some of them, you're like,
why?
Yeah.
It becomes so evident in this one as well, though, that there are so many people along this line that would need access to these checks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just don't know how a lot of these people were able to do their job or didn't feel uncomfortable. Certainly one of the engineers being like, but I had no way of checking, so why would I?
Yeah. That's not an attitude to bring to that sort of thing, but it's also understandable.
Yeah, I can see how it's so hard when you're fighting against a big system like that sure, one lone person is unlikely to have that effect of change, but yeah, how it had not been identified before is interesting.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
And for anyone going to the ECA this year,
Do enjoy.
maybe just keep this in mind while you're there. Be safe.
Thanks for bearing with us with our exceptionally long case that has run over a few episodes. Sorry about the break in between.
It's worrying when our discussion of it needs to be many hours because
Fair.
that means there are many, many, many issues
Yes.
going on.
Yeah.
I did enjoy the collaboration though, so I look forward to doing this again.
Yeah, I'm super interested to see how it turns out. So yeah, feel free to
Provide advice and
give us feedback on whether you liked these more conversational compilation
Collaborative.
episodes. Collaborative, I like that.
And tune in next week for part 2 of this episode, where we continue our discussion about the many concerning features of the Airmax ride.